Cronkite's Vietnam Report, Reel 1, Tease, Take 4.
These ruins are in Saigon, capital and largest city of South Vietnam. They were left here by an act of war, Vietnamese against Vietnamese. Hundreds died here. Here in these ruins can be seen physical evidence of the Viet Cong's Tet Offensive. But far less tangible is what these ruins mean, and like everything else in this burned and blasted and weary land, they mean success or setback, victory or defeat, depending upon whom you talk to.
I believe it gives to the VC, it shows first to the VC that the Vietnamese people from whom they hope to have a general uprising and to welcome the VC in the city, this is a very bad test for them.
I think that people have realized now that there's no secure areas. Your own home in the heart of the city is not secure. I am stunned myself when I see that the Viet Cong can come to your door, knock the door, and just kill you instantly without any warning, and yourself without any protection from the government.
There are doubts about the measure of success or setback, but even more, there are doubts about the exact measure of the disaster itself. All that is known with certainty is that on the first two nights of the Tet Lunar New Year's, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regular forces, violating the truce agreed on for that holiday, struck across the entire length of South Vietnam, hitting the largest 35 cities, towns, and provincial capitals. How many died and how much damage was done, however, are still but approximations, despite the official figures. The very preciseness of the figures brings them under suspicion. Anyone who has wandered through these ruins knows that an exact count is impossible. Why, just a short while ago, a little old man came and told us that 2 VC were buried in a hastily dug grave up at the end of the block. Had they been counted? And what about these ruins? Have they gone through all of them for buried civilians and soldiers? And what about those 14 VC we found in the courtyard behind the post office at Hue? Had they been counted and tabulated? They certainly hadn't been buried. We came to Vietnam to try to determine what all this means to the future of the war here. We talked to officials, top officials, civilian and military, Vietnamese and American. We toured damaged areas like this and refugee centers. We paid a visit to the battle at Hue and to the men manning the northernmost provinces where the next big communist offensive is expected. All of this is the subject of our report.
Who, what, when, where, why. Brought to you by the Connecticut General Life Insurance Company. At Connecticut General, we do things a little differently.
Tonight, Report from Vietnam by Walter Cronkite.
How could the Vietnamese communists have mounted this offensive with such complete surprise? After all, the cities were supposed to be secure, except for the occasional, unpreventable attack of terrorism. As a matter of fact, the whole measure of the success of this war had been that we were pushing out from the secure cities, pacifying the countryside around them in an increasingly widening ring. Now all that seemed to be knocked into a cocked hat. How could it happen? Well, let's take a look. Well, for one thing, it was the enemy's timing, the Tet lunar holiday. For Asiatics, it's Christmas and New Year's and 4th of July all rolled into one, with a little touch of Memorial Day, too. And just like Americans, they all take to the roads to go visit their family and their friends. Well, this is a normal day's traffic in Saigon. Imagine it 2 or 3 times this big for the Tet holiday. The job of stopping each of these cars and searching them and checking the people for their papers, why, it staggers the imagination. It staggered the ability of the Vietnamese police to handle, too. While some residents of Saigon certainly had to be privy to the communist plans, there didn't have to be a lot of them, as some people have charged. Just a few Viet Cong sympathizers in whose homes arms could be stored, arms smuggled into town, one by one, or even piece by piece. And then, on the night of Tet, the soldiers, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, slipped into town one by one, rendezvoused at the arms caches, and the offensive was on. The intelligence people, American and Vietnamese, agree on the same story. They figured the enemy might launch a big attack on Saigon or another South Vietnamese city. But they admit they grossly underestimated the enemy's ability to plan, to provision, to coordinate, to launch such a widespread, full-scale attack as this. There's some odd stories about this intelligence failure. High American sources, for instance, say that they warned the Vietnamese, but they let their troops go on Tet leave anyway until some units were down to just 10% of normal strength. Some American newsmen say they tried to reach the Vietnamese General Staff headquarters and only a sergeant was on duty. There are even stories believed by many Vietnamese intellectuals that Chief of Police Loan and Vice President Ky warned President Thieu, but Thieu thought it was some sort of a trick, perhaps a coup, and ignored the warnings. Thieu himself was at his country home at Mae Tho outside of town. Took him 6 hours to get back after the attack. And in the meantime, Vice President Ky signed the first defensive orders, and many Vietnamese intellectuals thought that indeed Ky had engineered a coup. There was even a suspicion that some of the police on checkpoint duty on the highways outside of town accepted bribes instead of identity papers, all in the spirit of Tet, and that many communists got in that way. But with all of this planning, what did the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong hope to accomplish? Well, we talked to a long-time expert on the Viet Cong who translated many of the captured documents and interrogated prisoners. Douglas Pike, about that.
Well, I think that General Giap, who I see as the master architect of the offensive, was trying to do 3 things. I think he was trying to cause the disintegration of ARVN, the Vietnamese Armed Forces, as an organized military system. I think he was trying to cause an uprising of people in the cities, civilians, in a kind of spontaneous outburst of support for the Viet Cong. And I think he was trying to throw a monkey wrench into what he considers the well-oiled American military machine here. It seems to me all the evidence trying to put things together after this battle, that those were his major calculations.
If the communist intention was to take and seize the cities, they came closer here at Hue than anywhere else. And now, 3 weeks after the offensive began, the firing still goes on from here on the new side of the city and across the Perfume River to the old side, the Citadel. Probably a week before this offensive began, the Army of North Vietnam, with Viet Cong support, began moving into the mountains south of here, 1 day's march away. And then the day before the offensive began, January 30th to 31st, they began that march toward the city. Meanwhile, another regiment of the NVA was moving in from the north into the city, the old Citadel, from the north. And they swept quickly through it too, except for a small corner in the northeast of the Citadel held by the South Vietnamese Army headquarters. It was a tough fight. It was house to house, door to door, room to room. They found they couldn't get into the doors and the windows. The North Vietnamese Army held them too tightly and booby-trapped them as well. They had to blast their way in with plastic charges placed against the sides of the houses. It was such a tough fight that although the American Army hoped not to use heavy weapons and airstrikes against this old city, they finally had to bring them in to begin to win the battle. The destruction here was almost total. There's scarcely an inhabitable building in the city of Wei. Whatever price the communists paid for this offensive, the price to the Allied cause was high. For if our intention is to restore normalcy, peace, serenity to this country, the destruction of those qualities in this, the most historical and probably serene of all South Vietnam cities, is obviously a setback. Now, a job no one had dreamed we were going to have to undertake. It is now the rebuilding of an entire city and the lives of the people in it. What did the communists hope to achieve by this attack on the cities? As to their ultimate objective, their maximum goal, prisoner interrogations and captured documents seem to leave no doubt. They hoped, at the best, to bring down the Saigon government and win the war, presumably either by forcing a defeated enemy to the peace table or by actually capturing his capital. To achieve that knockout victory, the 60,000 or so troops they committed to the battle had two prime targets. First, to seize as much real estate as possible, such as the presidential palace, the U.S. embassy, military headquarters, provincial capitals. And second, to kidnap or assassinate members of the thinning ranks of Vietnamese leadership. But they had shorter range objectives about which they could be far more certain of success. They expected the Allies to pull their troops off the pacification campaign in the countryside and bring them in for the defense of the cities. They expected the Americans to commit some of their reserves at least to the defense of the cities rather than hold them for the big battles expected at the demilitarized zone. They expected to create maximum economic confusion and disruption, and to create new hordes of refugees among which the seeds of discontent against the government could be sown. They expected, by destroying the myth of the security of the cities, to widen the credibility gap that exists here too between what the people are told and what they see about them. And the experts do not agree on the objectives or on the amount of success the communists had in achieving them.
They have certainly disrupted the pacification effort for the time being. For how long, I don't know. We haven't yet full reports on the situation. They have interdicted lines of communication, which are now being opened up again. What other effect they may have had, I don't know, on the population.
War damages, I think, have been tremendous. I have talked to quite a few Vietnamese here who have been in Vietnam during the struggle for independence, during the partition of the country. And they all concur in the opinion that nothing has been so serious. I think that it will take perhaps weeks, if not much more, for the people to realize that we are going back to normal. Production is being suffered. You will have the problem shortage of jobs in the future. The refugee problem is tremendous. The rehabilitation of the damaged areas is a tremendous job. And I think that this is all the things which the Viet Cong attempt to achieve by this attack.
In that sense, they were successful then?
In that sense, I think they have been very successful.
Barren volcanic wasteland in Hawaii. Could man ever make it useful? Man did. On volcanic ashes and rock, he built an Hawaiian paradise. And money to help finance it came from an insurance company, Connecticut General. Half an ocean away in California, another investment to develop cattle land. And in Washington, water from a river far below has made farmlands lush and fertile. The first privately financed irrigation project in the area Connecticut General has made investments all over America, in land, in buildings, and in the way people live. What is being done to improve the way people live? What will the community of the future be like? Connecticut General is helping to finance a bold new answer on 22 square miles of rolling land between Baltimore and Washington. A group of 9 villages in a privately financed, imaginative new city. A city called Columbia, where stores, schools, work and recreation are close to home, where families have room to live, to grow, to enjoy. Where kids don't have to be driven everywhere. All insurance companies invest, but Connecticut General feels that a sound investment can also be creative. The Connecticut General Life Insurance Company. At Connecticut General, we do things a little differently.
The government's first big test in the wake of the Tet Offensive was the speed with which it could pick up the shattered pieces of its pacification program. And translated into priorities, that meant how quickly could it get the troops that have been pulled into the cities for their defense back into the countryside. The American military leadership, believing this a matter of great urgency, watched carefully, with some trepidation, the government's performance. Would it permit the troops brought into the cities to simply hunker down there indefinitely? Or would it move with dispatch to get them back on the offensive out in the country? Well, these are pacification troops, the black pajamaed men of the government's so-called revolutionary development teams. But they are not back in the countryside, bringing it and keeping it under government control. They are standing guard in a city. This one happens to be Ca Nan, because the South Vietnamese feel the cities still are far from secure. This is the nature of the setback. What's left of a typical hamlet, once believed secure, but abandoned as the pacification forces rushed to the cities. This district used to be a model of pacification. Now again, most of it is at the mercy of the enemy. Correspondent Robert Shackney talked to Captain Donald Jones, Deputy Pacification Advisor for the district.
Tui Phuc District used to be considered just about one of the most pacified areas in Vietnam. It isn't anymore, is it?
No, it used to be considered the bowl of pacification for South Vietnam. It was the area where the Revolutionary Development Program first began. It was a test phase for the pacification in South Vietnam. Now I cannot say that any longer. If it's not contested, the district is certainly challenged by main force units.
Well, in effect, is there any pacification program left for Tui Phuc District at this point?
No, for most of the district, pacification does not exist. This is a war.
There were places we used to be able to go to in Tui Phuc, in fact, where we filmed, like Tin Yang and Go Boy and Bin Quang. Could we go back there today?
We couldn't go to Vinh Quan. We might be able to get to Tin Yang. I wouldn't want to try it unless we have some local security. Go Boy, we can get to the south part of Go Boy. We can go straight out the road here to Go Boy. We can't cross a bridge.
I walked unarmed with just one major casualty through Go Boy in December. Could I do it today?
No, you could not. You could not walk through Go Boy today.
Are you discouraged?
Yes.
Pacification is not the only casualty of the Tet Offensive. These are refugees, most pathetic of all the victims of the attacks on the cities. Just yesterday, the U.S. command in Saigon estimated their number at 470,000. New human flotsam living in unbelievable squalor, huddled in schools and sheds and shanties. Before Tet, there were 800,000 officially listed as refugees, and one of the South Vietnamese government's greatest failures had been to provide them with decent food and shelter and a role in economic life. The government could salvage a measure of victory from defeat by moving with decision and dispatch to ease the plight of the new homeless, but there are few signs that it has the capacity or will to do so. And there may be more refugees to come, for the battle for the cities probably is not over. Here in Saigon, 3 weeks after the first wave of the attack was beaten back, there are still small but ferocious battles on the city's perimeter and even within the city's limits. At the big air base and U.S. military headquarters on the edge of town, there's still occasional mortar and rocket attacks. There are reports that elements of 3 North Vietnamese divisions, perhaps 15,000 men, are within a day's march of the city. The helicopters fill the air during the day in the constant hunt for them, and at night, airdrop flares light the city as the search goes on. And this is but phase 2 of a master Viet Cong plan called the Winter-Spring Offensive. Part 1 was the fall campaign against the Allied positions astride the Viet Cong supply routes through the Central Highlands. The attacks on Dak To and Loc Ninh were part of that campaign, and they failed. If they had succeeded, the Viet Cong would have opened up a supply route to bring in even more troops for the attack against the cities along the coast. Those attacks against 35 cities from Quang Tri in the far north to the Delta in the far south were phase 2, which at least in their initial military phase also have failed. Failed, that is, to seize the cities, although they've brought them to near paralysis. Now it's believed the enemy is ready to move on to phase 3 of the Winter-Spring Offensive with the hope that he can recoup there what he lost in the first 2 phases. Phase 3 is to be the attack along the demilitarized zone. He has massed perhaps 40,000 men along here and is expected to kick off at any moment a wide-scale offensive believed intended to overrun Vietnam's 2 most northernmost provinces and perhaps thus to bring the Saigon government in defeat to the conference table. He may move against any of those positions, but perhaps the most dramatic and significant battle may develop at Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh was designed to be a small border stronghold to block enemy infiltration and to provide forward air observation. Now surrounded and bypassed, it no longer serves that function. But for reasons of U.S. pride as much as U.S. tactics, Khe Sanh has been built up into a major bastion where 5,500 Marines are isolated, and not far from which 20,000 more reserves are tied down, far from the now unprotected coastal plains. From the North Vietnamese point of view, Khe Sanh is an ideal target for rocket and mortar attacks from the surrounding hills, while they decide the time to attack or whether to attack. But in an interview with CBS News correspondent Jack Lawrence, the Marine general in charge was confident his men can outlast the enemy at Khe Sanh and elsewhere.
How long do you feel that he can continue this increased tempo of the fighting?
Well, I can't really give a finite answer, but it would seem to me it would be in terms of a matter of months. 4, 5, how long, I wouldn't know exactly. He always has the capability, of course, of suddenly stopping this tremendous sacrifice of personnel and going back into the guerrilla type of war. So it's hard to prophesy. But if he continues this all-out attack day and night, exposing himself to our firepower, I just don't think he can keep it up for longer than a matter of months.
Whatever the battle for Khe Sanh and the DMZ means, whatever all of this means, there is one meaning to the Viet Cong's Winter-Spring Offensive that is inescapable. The nature of the Vietnamese war has changed. It no longer is a series of small engagements fought for local areas against small bands of communists. It no longer is to be fought primarily in the sparsely occupied countryside. It is now more along the classic Western fashion of war. Large armies locked in combat, moving toward a decision on the battlefield. Some final personal observations will be the concluding portion of this report. Tonight, back in more familiar surroundings in New York, we'd like to sum up our findings in Vietnam, an analysis that must be speculative, personal, subjective. Who won and who lost in the great Tet offensive against the cities? I'm not sure. The Viet Cong did not win by a knockout, but neither did we, and the referees of history may make it a draw. Another standoff may be coming in the big battles expected south of the demilitarized zone. Khe Sanh could well fall with a terrible loss in American lives, prestige, and morale, and this is a tragedy of our stubbornness there. But the bastion no longer is a key to the rest of the northern regions, and it is doubtful that the American forces can be defeated across the breadth of the DMZ with any substantial loss of ground. Another standoff. On the political front, past performance gives no confidence that the Vietnamese government can cope with its problems, now compounded by the attack on the cities. It may not fall, it may hold on, but it probably won't show the dynamic qualities demanded of this young nation. Another standoff. We have been too often disappointed by the optimism of the American leaders, both in Vietnam and Washington, to have faith any longer in the silver linings they find in the darkest clouds. They may be right that Hanoi's winter-spring offensive has been forced by the communist realization that they could not win the longer war of attrition, and that the communists hope that any success in the offensive will improve their position for eventual negotiations. It would improve their position, and it would also require our realization that we should have had all along, that any negotiations must be that, negotiations, not the dictation of peace terms. For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. This summer's almost certain standoff will either end in real give and take negotiations or terrible escalation. And for every means we have to escalate, the enemy can match us, and that applies to invasion of the North, the use of nuclear weapons, or the mere commitment of 100 or 200 or 300,000 more American troops to the battle. And with each escalation, the world comes closer to the brink of cosmic disaster. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.